Sometimes a game just does not get the appreciation it deserves. Welcome to Chaos Gaming, everybody. We've got a good one today. We are going to be looking at 25 games, so sit back and relax. And these games were way ahead of their time. Somehow these game developers looked into the future and they built their game in the future. They built it before it should have ever came out. So you let me know which of these you've actually played, which ones you're going to replay after you watch this video, because let's face it, whenever you click on a Chaos Gaming video, the nostalgia hits. It does. You know it does. Guys, drop a like. Make sure you share this around and turn on those notifications. We are trying to get Team Chaos. We're trying to get a good notification squad going here. And thank you again for 30,000 subscribers on the YouTube channel. And thank you for 174,000 on Facebook. All right, here we go. At number 25, games that were way ahead of their time. Guitar Freaks. Now, if this game looks familiar, it's because Guitar Hero basically ripped off their entire formula. Guitar Freaks was released all the way back in 1999 as an arcade game. You guessed it, you would use a plastic guitar to play along to the music on the screen, and it was pretty addicting. It was basically Dance Dance Revolution, but with a guitar, and 6 years later, Guitar Hero came along and swiped most of its foundation from it. Guitar Freaks was a solid game, but it didn't really catch on with a lot of people. I mean, rhythm games, they weren't in demand yet, but a few years later, that's when video games were more established and the market was growing. Guitar Hero took the world by storm. Now, if Guitar Freaks had been released just a few years later, it probably could have seen the same success. I bet those developers are just furious. At number 24, Mercenaries Playground of Destruction. Raise your hand if you remember this game. Released for the PS2 and the Xbox back in 2005. Mercenaries was an open-world action game with lots of player choice, a whole bunch of weapons, and practically endless replay value because the amount of ridiculous things you could actually do. Mercenaries was one of the most elaborate sandbox games ever released at that time, but due to intense competition as well as the fact that sandbox games, they weren't popular yet, it flew under the radar. Many outlets wrote it off as a GTA clone. Some even criticized it for giving the player too much control. How can you do that? I mean, come on, really? Critics. Mercenaries was way ahead of its time, and if it had been released 5 years later, it probably would have been a hit. 23. Far Cry. The OG. Released for the PC in 2004. The original Far Cry was actually developed by Crytek, the same team that would go on to make Crysis, so you can probably guess what I'm going to say here. Far Cry was not only graphically ahead of its time, but in terms of the game's scale, nothing came close to it. Not only were the levels huge, but the gameplay was extremely dynamic. Far Cry gave you so many ways to approach every combat encounter. You could go in guns blazing, you could go stealthy, you could go and try to distract the enemies, you could use the environment to your advantage. The list goes on and on. Far Cry 1 was an insanely detailed game with far more depth than any other FPS on the market at that time. If you haven't played the original game, I recommend going back. Check it out because you'll instantly notice all the things that Crytek innovated with it. At number 22, Metal Gear Solid. Released for the PS1 in 1998. It had a huge impact on the industry. It innovated a lot of things that would later become commonplace, although the competition needed a few years to catch up. Metal Gear Solid not only helped popularize stealth games as we know them, but it also featured full voice acting and full motion cutscenes that were rendered using the game's engine. Plus, the plot, it was complex. It was more complex than most video games at that time, which helped establish Hideo Kojima as one of the main names in game development. Metal Gear Solid's influence was felt for years, and it still does some of these things better than games in 2021. At number 21, speaking of 21, Shenmue. Released in 99 for the Dreamcast, Shenmue was one of the most expensive games ever made at that time. It was written off by a lot of people. I mean, it had shortcomings, but when you look at it, it was way ahead of its time. It was one of the first 3D open world games ever released, and the amount of detail was epic. I mean, NPCs had routines to follow. Shops would open. They would close, depending on the time of day. And there was also arguably, this was the game that invented QuickTime events. All this inside a game that released for the Dreamcast in 99. Shenmue may have been a crappy game, but a large portion of that crap was good because it was new, and it paved the way for so many things. It may not be very fun to play, but it was a technical marvel. At number 20. Grand Theft Auto 3. Speaking of early open world games, GTA 3 was really the game that established the modern open world formula, and it did it all the way back in 2001. Now, GTA 3 had a massive open world, lots of NPCs all doing their own thing, and all throughout that, it had a really good story. Excellent presentation, lots of stuff to do. Plus, this was back when Rockstar was making games a little more open-ended, so there was a lot of different ways you could approach your objectives. GTA 3 practically invented open world games as we know them, and even in 2021, there are open world games that come out and cannot match the level of detail and exploration from a game we got almost 20 years ago. At number 19, Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six. Released in 98. 98 was a good year for games. The original Rainbow Six completely changed tactical shooters. You played as an elite group of operatives, you're completing a series of missions, and you have a lot of methods to complete these missions. It was elaborate. Any mistakes you made would end up screwing you up later, and this encouraged deep planning and multiple playthroughs. It was one of the most detailed shooters in the world that we've ever seen back then, and it took a while for the series to catch on as the competition started to catch up. At number 18, Battlefield 2142. Did you ever play this? The sci-fi military shooter released years before that genre took off. This game dropped in 2006 for the PC, and it brought the realistic gameplay of Battlefield into the future. It added sci-fi tech, weapons, vehicles, and at this point in gaming history, sci-fi shooters were mainly things like Halo or Gears of War. But more grounded, realistic sci-fi military games, that wasn't a thing. They were still about a decade away from being mainstream, and EA and DICE were way ahead of the curve. Battlefield 2142, it got decent reviews, its sales, but it was dropped by many fans of the franchise due to the abundance of bugs, and in 2014, the servers were shut off. It's pretty crazy to think that almost a decade before franchises like COD and Titanfall shot us into the future, Battlefield had already been there and done that. At number 17, GoldenEye 007. It's one of the most innovative games of its time, of all time, honestly. It's one of my favorites. But have you ever thought about just how ahead of its time it was? It launched for the N64, 1997. It helped prove the console shooters were totally viable, but what was the big next console shooter after this game? Perfect Dark? Halo? I mean, those were more than 3 years away from GoldenEye. GoldenEye didn't just prove that FPS games could work on console, but they were so far ahead of the curve that it took the industry another 3 years to follow their lead. This is a top 5 all-time game for me, and it was way ahead of its time. Number 16, Chrono Trigger. Let's go back even farther. Released in 95, it is often cited as one of the most influential RPGs of all time. I mean, the amount of detail and content in 1995, it innovated tons of things that are now commonplace in the RPG genre, multiple endings, more detailed side quests, a very refined combat system that keeps you engaged. Chrono Trigger was way ahead of its time, and for a 1995 RPG, I mean, come on. You go back and play it today, you will instantly notice the impact that it had on the future of gaming. Top 15, people. We're about almost halfway home. Fear. The game was released in 2005, and the AI is still some of the best I've ever experienced right now. In terms of gameplay and structure, pretty simple. First-person shooter. Very good one, mind you, but a very simple one. However, what gets the game on the list today is specifically the enemy AI, which has some of the most sophisticated that the world has ever seen. Like I said, it still holds up. The enemies in this game would learn from your attacks. They would use the environment to their advantage to the point that it felt like you were playing against real humans. Fear is a great game, but the AI in particular was out of this world, and it deserves a spot on this list. Heck, the game is 16 years old, and people still go digging into the game code to try to figure out what made the AI so good in Fear. At number 14, Uncharted: Drake's Fortune. Most people kind of write off the first Uncharted game. It's widely seen as the weakest in the series. It's not hard to see why, but the reason I put it on this list is because this game helped establish cinematic third-person action games as we know them. It took that third-person foundation of Gears, and it added more cutscenes, quick-time events, and a more movie-like presentation to make it feel like you were an action star, and it did. The later games heavily improved upon that original foundation, but without Uncharted 1, Sony never would have found that winning formula of cinematic third-person action games. Sure, they're not everybody's cup of tea, but it all started with Uncharted 1 back in 2007. Almost 15 years later, the formula is still winning. At number 13, Prince of Persia 3D. Now, if you know your gaming history, you probably know that this game is not very good. In fact, most people will agree it's the worst in the series. So why is it so high up on the list? Well, because despite it not being very fun to play, Prince of Persia 3D had some of the best character animations in gaming history, and they still look good. The way the character models moved and interacted with the environments was way ahead of its time. This game came out in 99, and the animations still look better than a lot of 21st century games. So, no, it wasn't a good game. You won't have much fun playing it, but if we're looking at the technical aspects, Prince of Persia 3D was at least a decade ahead of the competition. At number 12, Demon's Souls. Released in 2009, it was developed by From Software, the first entry in their now beloved Souls series. Very difficult, very punishing action RPG that laid the foundation for, you guessed it, the Dark Souls franchise. But what about Demon Souls? The game was largely ignored by the general public, and while it got some decent reviews and even won a few awards, it didn't catch on. So a couple years later, From Software released a spiritual successor called Dark Souls, and you already know, that's where the snowball started, right? It laid the foundation, though, for Dark Souls. It was one of the most influential RPGs ever made, and the reputation of the franchise eventually got it a full remake on the PS5. Demon Souls originally launched in 2009, but the mainstream gaming would barely even acknowledge that. If you ask me, I think it deserves to be on this list. At number 11, Super Mario 64. One of the first 3D platformers. Super Mario 64 was this gigantic influence on the industry and so far ahead of its curve that it took 2 to 3 years for other developers to even catch up. It took the foundation of Super Mario Bros. And Super Mario World, and it brought it all into this fully 3D world complete with new mechanics. You had boss fights, levels with multiple ways you could get them to end. It was industry-changing as an experience, and like I said, it was way ahead of the competition. This game launched in '96. It took another 2 to 3 years for 3D platformers to become commonplace because Nintendo was just that ahead of the curve with this one. Now we've reached the top 10. Spider-Man 2, 2004. Now, open-world superhero games are commonplace. Back in the early 2000s, open-world games were a brand new genre, and superhero games were pretty much just all linear beat-em-ups. Well, in 2004, we got the movie tie-in game for Spider-Man 2, which blew people away, and movie tie-in games don't usually do that. A fully open-world superhero game, side missions, NPCs to save, secrets to find, fun story that expanded upon the movie. It was so far ahead of its time, and it was a huge influence on open-world games as a whole. Games like Arkham Asylum and PS4 Spider-Man, they would not exist if it wasn't for Spider-Man 2 all the way back in 2004. At number 9, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. Now, this is a left field pick, but I need you to hear me out. It was released for the Famicom back in 1987, and then the NES in '88. And compared to other Zelda titles, it's different. 2D action RPG that a lot of Zelda fans hated because it was so different when you look back at it. This was one of the first action RPGs ever. It had a huge influence on the action platforming genre. Zelda 2 was one of the first games to actually combine platforming with RPG elements. And when you look at the structure of the levels and the gameplay, it's very similar to modern action RPGs like Dark Souls and Diablo, but it came out in 1987. It's a good game. It's just frequently written off because being super different from the rest of the franchise. So, if you've never played this, go check it out. You'll see what I mean. The game was way ahead of its time. It was way ahead of the action RPG curve. At number 8, System Shock 2. Released in '99, it's often seen as one of the best horror games ever made. You got this big spaceship, genetic infection, kills the crew, you have to deal with a sinister AI, calling the shots, captain's gone, you know. The attention to detail was incredible, far deeper than anything else on the market at that time. The storytelling was also very elaborate and detailed, which added to the experience. System Shock 2 is a masterpiece. It is. You should give it a go if you haven't. The devs later on, they made a spiritual successor. You may know it as BioShock, but yeah. At number 7, The Oregon Trail. Released all the way back in 1971. That is not an error. 1971. The Oregon Trail was a text-based strategy game where you simply tried to get a group of settlers across the American plains in the 19th century. Now, along the way, you had to solve puzzles, determine the best course of action to get all your party members to your destination still breathing. The amount of detail in Oregon Trail, there was a lot. It paved the way for video games as a whole. Let me repeat. The game came out in 1971. If that doesn't qualify as ahead of its time, we should probably just stop the video. At number 6, Shadow of the Colossus. Released in late 2005 for the PS2. It was a phenomenal experience. You venture around the maps, you take on giant monsters after giant monsters after giant monsters. It was good. The graphics, the gameplay, the soundtrack, the monster design, it was unlike anything we'd ever seen. Back in 2005, games simply didn't look this good. They didn't, or have this kind of scale, or this much emotional impact. Shadow of the Colossus was influential. It's definitely a must-play if you're a fan of video games at all. And now we've reached the top 5. Half-Life. Has to be one of the most influential games of its time, right? It dropped in '98. It helped establish so many things that we hold dear to FPS games. The storytelling, unique. The level design, grounded and interesting. The enemies, all unique and far more sophisticated than any other shooters at that time. And the physics engine, unmatched for the late 90s. Come on. It changed the industry, and even after it launched, it took a couple years for other FPS shooters to catch up. This next one you may have never heard of. Trespasser Jurassic Park. Released in 1998, it's often seen as one of the worst games of its time. Terrible graphics, confusing gameplay, and a bizarre story that made no sense. But the technical aspects of the game were mind-blowing, and it had a huge influence on first-person shooters. Hear me out. Compared to other FPS games at the time, Trespasser was detailed. It was story-focused. The graphics, they were impressive, as this was one of the best-looking games of its time. The gameplay and the story may have been awful, but the technical achievements, they couldn't be understated. At number 3, Team Fortress 2. It popularized a lot of things that you and me think are common. Cartoony art style, cast of characters, multiplayer shooter. Heck, the game practically invented the hero shooter genre. TF2 dropped in 2007, and it's still one of the most popular games on Steam despite being almost 14 years old. I mean, it simply does things better than other games. It does. The balance, the characterization, the gameplay, the replay value, it's still some of the best in the hero shooter genre today. And it's arguably the first game to ever wear that label in the first place. So here it is. At number 2, World of Warcraft. Speaking of games that practically invented their genre, come on. MMORPG, laid the foundation for every other MMO after it. Make your character, choose your faction, venture out in the world, make friends, complete quests, level up your character. Just about every MMO released after 2004 copied WoW. They did. And even in 2021, every new MMO is still going to be compared to it. It wasn't the first MMO. It may not have been your favorite, but it laid so much of the foundation of the MMO genre, I think it's way ahead of its time. And at number 1 today, of games that were so far ahead of their time, Crysis. Yep, released for the PC in 2007, it quickly gained a reputation for being one of the most detailed games ever made. Now, if you were lucky enough to have a NASA computer, you would be treated some of the best visuals of the gaming world that we've ever seen, and they still hold up today. Crysis 1 on max settings is a sight to behold, and back in the day, it was mind-blowing. Now, we're pretty spoiled by eye candy games now, but back in 2007, nothing came close to Crysis, and it was used as a benchmark for PC gaming for over a decade. It was way ahead of its time on the technical side, and it took years for other studios to catch up. So for that reason, it's number 1. And you know what else? If you made it to the end of this video, you are number 1. I truly, truly appreciate you guys. Let me know one game that deserved to be on this list that didn't make it, and I'll see you soon.